Have you ever seen the movie The Changeling with Angelina Jolie, directed by Clint Eastwood? Did you know that that movie is based on a true story? Did you know that the true story is actually more sinister than what the movie even portrays? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about on this next episode of Peculiar Finds for Curious Minds. And I'm Jennifer Kennedy. Don't forget to check out my website, peculiartalk.com, where you'll find my psychic services that I offer, including psychic readings with tarot readings, oracle readings, and rune readings, as well as psychic services for the police, paranormal teams, and more. You can also find every episode on the website, and you can subscribe to it on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Podomatic, and YouTube. So today's episode, I'm going to tell you about the Wineville chicken coop murders, also known as the Wineville chicken murders. They occurred in a little town called Wineville, California, between 1926 and 1928. Wineville was named after the grape crops that it was famous for, but it was a little tiny, tight-knit town. The Wineville chicken coop murders were committed by a very sadistic sex maniac named Gordon Stewart Northcott. He carried out kidnapping, sexual abuse, and murders of children for 2 years. In 1926, he moved from Canada to California, and he asked his father to build a chicken ranch for him. His father obliged. So his father helped pay for and build a chicken ranch for him. And later on that year, he went back to Canada at the age of 21, and he tried to convince his sister Jessie to allow her son, Sanford Clark, which was his nephew, who was 13 years old, to come with him to California to help him on his chicken farm, but she just wasn't convinced. So he kidnapped Sanford. She wasn't too concerned because she knew that it was her brother that took him, but eventually, she went for such a long period of time without hearing any communication from her son Sanford that she got worried, and she scraped up the money to travel down from Canada to California to the chicken farm to check on him and see how he was doing. When she got there, she was horrified with what she saw, which I'll tell you later what she saw. She acted like everything was normal, and she went back to Canada in September of 1928. As soon as she got back, she called U.S. authorities and immigration and told them that Gordon had kidnapped her son, he was abusing him, and that he even attacked her. Those U.S. authorities contacted the local Los Angeles police, and then the police went to the farm to check things out, and they found Sanford there alone. So they took him in for questioning, and this was on September 15th of 1928. Now, they expected to hear some bad things, but they just were not prepared for the insane story that Sanford told them. He told them that Gordon had beaten him, given him death threats, that he raped him and he was a victim of sexual abuse, that he had attacked and nearly strangled him to death. He told him that Mexican boys would arrive at the farm in Gordon's car, but then they would disappear shortly after. He told him that Gordon forced him to watch the abuse and murder of 4 specific boys as well as others, and that Gordon forced him to participate. He told him about an unnamed Mexican boy that Gordon beheaded. He told him about the Winslow brothers, Louis, age 12, and Nelson, age 10, and he told him about Walter Collins, age 9. He said that Gordon would kidnap the boys from town in order to take them back and rape them. He would sodomize them himself and with foreign objects, not just the boys, but Sanford as well. He would beat and torture them. He would punish them by throwing them into pits dug into the chicken coops for days at a time. But once he got bored with the boys, he would then lead them to the incubator room in the chicken coop in order to see the hatchling chicks. And when they were looking at the hatchling chicks, He would kill them with an axe and chop up the bodies. Then he would cover the bodies in quicklime in order to hide them. The stories were so crazy and far-fetched that the police didn't initially believe him, but then they started poking around. Now let's talk about Walter Collins. This is the primary boy that kicked off everything. He disappeared on March 10th in 1928. His mom had given him some money to go see a movie. His dad was in prison for robbery, so it was just his mom. A neighbor had last seen him around 5 p.m. in the neighborhood while he was walking to go see the movie. Now at this time, police were under investigation for corruption, and the police chief himself was under an extreme amount of pressure in order to solve the case of Walter being missing. It was embarrassing to the whole department that they couldn't find this little boy. Well, in August, police in Illinois had picked up a boy who gave them the name Arthur Kent. At first, this boy would only say that his father had abandoned him. He wouldn't tell the police anything else about who he was. So the police put him in a temporary foster home. And again, this is the Illinois police. Eventually, he told the Illinois police that his name was Walter Collins, and they matched that up with the Walter Collins missing in California, so they sent him to Los Angeles. The police in Los Angeles brought him to Walter's mother, but she knew right away that it wasn't him. They had actually showed her pictures beforehand, and she said it wasn't her son. But police told her to take him home and, quote, try him out for a couple of weeks, because they just didn't want to look bad. So she took him home, and 3 weeks later she brought the boy back to the police station along with dental records and signed statements from people who knew Walter, like one of his teachers, proving that it was not her son. She kept telling police over these 3 weeks, this isn't her son, but they just kept brushing it off. They thought maybe she was just under stress because of the traumatic situation she had gone through with Walter missing. Police Chief Captain J.J. Jones told her she was a lunatic. He accused her of trying to pawn her son off on the state so that they would take care of him and she wouldn't have to, thinking that she just didn't have the money to take care of him. And he accused her of trying to just embarrass the police department. So he had her locked up in a psychiatric ward in Los Angeles County General Hospital under what's called Code 12. A Code 12 is a code that would allow police officers to get rid of troublemakers legally without being questioned. Just basically anybody that caused them any trouble that they didn't want to deal with or that they wanted to just lock away, they would commit them and say Code 12. It was a legal way to get away with getting rid of people. Now this was all going on during the same time when police were questioning Sanford. So Sanford told police that Walter was actually killed by Gordon's mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, and Sanford himself. He told them that they all took turns hitting Walter with an axe. And not long after that, the story hit the public. And then that's when fake Walter admitted to being a hoax, admitting that he was Arthur Hutchins, Jr., aged 15. It's kind of questionable. Some sources say he was 12, some say he was 13, and some say he was 15. That he was originally from Iowa. Well, when that happened, Collins sued the police. But we'll get more on that later. We're going to backtrack a little bit and kind of bounce around here. In 2008, the movie The Changeling with Angelina Jolie, directed by Clint Eastwood, is about that situation. About Walter Collins and his mother, played by Angelina Jolie. It focuses more on that than the actual crime. They do touch on the crime of Gordon Northcott towards the end, and they show him in the end of the movie, but the bulk of the movie is based on missing Walter and this fake boy that the police put in Mrs. Collins' home, playing him off to be Walter. Now back to Sanford and the police. Sanford told the police that they killed Walter because he had witnessed Gordon help another man kill his mining partner. There's not a whole lot of information about that, so I don't know how accurate that is, but supposedly that's one of the things that Sanford told the police. He also told them that they would find the graves for the Winslow brothers and Walter by the chicken coop. Now let me tell you about the Winslow brothers. There were two brothers, then they disappeared on May 16th in 1928. After their disappearance, their parents had received several strange letters from them. One of them said that they were running away and heading to Mexico. Another letter said that they were planning to stay missing for a long time in order to get famous. And their parents thought it was strange. And at the time, the police didn't link the case to Walter's or any other missing children or children bodies that had been found. They thought everything was unrelated at the time. There was also, during this time period, a Latino boy's body. It was found headless in February 1928. It was wrapped in a burlap sack that later on they found matched the sacks at the farm. But when they initially found him, he was found before Walter went missing. He was found back in February. So they didn't think anything of the sack until later on down the road when they had gone to the farm. Also in 1928, a neighbor to the farm, which the farmland was pretty desolate. There's not anything around the farm. So for a neighbor to witness anything at the farm, they were pretty far away. They had to have been visiting the farm. But at any rate, in 1928, a neighbor to the farm had reported to the police that there was a man on the farm mistreating a boy there. But the police never pursued the complaint. Eventually, police raided the farm after they had talked to Sanford, and they didn't find the entire bodies by the chicken coops, but they did find bones, bone fragments, and skull fragments. Axes were found among the equipment on the property, and they had blood and hair all over them. They found many bones of male children scattered all across the entire farm area. They also found a small whistle, children's clothing, a Boy Scout cap, and several Boy Scout badges. Inside the house, they found a library book that had been checked out by one of the Winslow boys, and part of the flyleaf cover was torn off. And they discovered later on that that flyleaf cover section that had been torn off matched the flyleaf paper that one of the strange letters that the Winslow boys' parents had received. The letter was written on that piece of flypaper, so they were able to match that. They also found other letters from the Winslow boys written to their parents that had not been mailed yet, but there was nothing found that was directly connected to Walter Collins. Once the news broke of everything that was found on the farm, it went national very quickly, as you can imagine, and the media just descended upon Wineville. They nicknamed Gordon the Ape Man because of his thick black hair on his arms and back, and they nicknamed his farm the Murder Farm. It made headlines across the whole country. Only 2 days after police raided the farm, Gordon's father contacted them and told them that Gordon had admitted to him that he had committed the murders. But by that time, Gordon and his mother had already fled to Canada, but they were quickly caught and sent right back to California. Even after all of this, because there was nothing found that connected Gordon to Walter Collins, the police continued to insist to Walter Collins' mother that the fake Collins boy was the real Walter Collins. At this point, the fake Walter Collins, his name was Arthur, had not admitted it yet. This was all, happening kind of all at the same time. So, they had raided the farm and they didn't find anything linking it to Walter Collins. Despite Sanford's story, the police, in order to save face, continued to insist that this Arthur kid is actually Walter Collins. But they finally let that go when they called in an expert handwriting analyst. Now, this expert compared handwriting from some old papers that Walter had written on to Arthur's handwriting, and he noted that the two styles were completely different. The letter R in the fake boy's writing was kind of strange compared to the letter R in writing in California, because the way that Arthur wrote his letter R's was only taught in Illinois schools, not in California, so it kind of gave it away. So once this expert came in and analyzed the handwriting, the police said, okay, fine, it's not Arthur. We think it might be somebody else. And when all that started to culminate, that's when Arthur admitted that he was a fake. He told police that people had told him that he looked like Walter. So that's why he decided to claim that he was him. Some reports say that he did it to get to Hollywood so he could meet his cowboy hero Tom Mix. Other reports say that he did it to get away from his stepmother. He knew that Mrs. Collins knew that he wasn't her son when he was living with her those 3 weeks, but he viewed it as a game that they just were playing back and forth. But once everything went down, his stepmom came to get him, and he showed absolutely no remorse for what he had done. It didn't bother him one bit. His stepmom got him, and she took him home. And we really don't know much of anything else after that about the fake kid Arthur. Shortly after his stepmom took him home, though, Mrs. Collins was released from the psychiatric ward. I mean, they kind of had to. They put her there because they said she was crazy and delusional over, the whole incident of her son missing, and she just couldn't accept that he was back and, trying to get out of taking care of him. Well, now that it came to be that the kid was fake, they had to let her out of the psychiatric ward. Back to Gordon. On September 20th in 1928, Gordon was arrested. They found him in British Columbia, and his mother was arrested in Alberta. In December, police took Gordon back to the farm, hoping to get some more information out of him. And while he was there, he did verbally confess to 5 murders, including the Winslow boys, Walter Collins, and a Mexican boy named Alvin Gothea. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But later on, when they got back to the station and asked him to write his confession down, he only confessed to the murder of Alvin Gothea. Moving forward, in December, Sarah Louise, his mother, pled guilty to the Collins murder. She confessed that she dealt the final blow with the axe, and she confessed to burying him in a hole next to the chicken coop, which matched Sanford's story that they could find him buried next to the chicken coop. Sanford had told police that she told him that if they each hit the boy at least once, then they all would be equally guilty of the murder if they were all caught, or if any of them were caught. It was kind of a scare tactic to make sure that he wouldn't tell. She wound up getting life in prison, but she only served 10 years. She went in 1930, and she was released on parole in 1940, and she died only 4 years after that. Gordon didn't really confess to much of anything else other than the written confession of the Mexican boy's murder. He went to trial. His trial began on January 11th of 1929. He was tried for the headless Mexican child, which is the one that he confessed to in the written confession, and the Winslow brothers. Sanford testified against him, and during his testimony at one point, Gordon yelled out in the courtroom, "He's lying." Sanford had testified that one night Gordon came home with a bucket that had the Mexican boy's head in it. Sanford also told about the Winslow brothers' murders. He admitted that he struck the younger one. He said, quote, "I hit him first with the axe because Stewart told me that if I didn't, he would kill me." Family members referred to Gordon as Stewart. I guess he went by the name Stewart. I call him Gordon, but he went by the name Stewart. Now, Gordon insisted on cross-examining Sanford himself. He was so angry. And the judge allowed it, but his lawyers didn't want him to, so he just fired them. Mid-trial, he fired all his lawyers. They all got up and left. They were disgusted. And that left him to defend himself through the rest of the trial. And from there on, it just turned into a giant circus of absurdity throughout the trial. It became even more absurd when Gordon got on the stand and questioned himself. He would ask himself questions, and then he would answer those questions himself, rather than just going up and just giving his testimony. It's said to have been very bizarre. Throughout the whole trial, though, he did admit to abusing the young boys, but he kept saying that the reason he did it was because he loved them. Through the whole trial, repeatedly, he kept talking about how much he loved these boys, and he admitted to abusing them. They even brought his mother in to testify for him, not against him. She'd already pled guilty. She'd already told the story about Walter. But they brought her in to testify for him on his behalf. So when she testified, things got even weirder. In her testimony, she claimed that she wasn't even his biological mother. She claimed that she was his grandmother. She had claimed that her husband had raped her daughter Winifred, and that Gordon was actually Winifred's son, not hers. Gordon, when he testified that his father had sodomized him at the age of 10, that his father had molested him and sexually abused him, that Sarah, his mother or grandmother, depending on who you want to believe, dressed him in girls' clothes until he was 16, and that he had had an incestuous relationship with Sarah Louise. None of the family incest stories were able to be verified, so it's not really known if these things are true. This is just what he and his mother had testified to, but there's no evidence, there's no witnesses, no other family members backing these stories up. So, it's really not known if it's true or not. And Sarah Louise, during her testimony, really wasn't considered to be a very trustworthy witness because her stories kept changing. They were inconsistent. They say that the only consistent thing that she said during her entire testimony was that she would do anything for Gordon. So if she's going to repeatedly say she'll do anything for Gordon, I mean, it's not so far-fetched to think she would lie for him, too. It's not really known how true these statements are, just that they were made during the testimony. On February 8th, 1929, this is about a month after the trial started, an all-male jury found Gordon guilty of first-degree murder of the Winslow boys and an anonymous victim. That's all they say, is an anonymous victim, even though he had confessed to the Mexican boy. Maybe the anonymous victim was the Mexican boy. Maybe they had to make him anonymous because they weren't able to ID the body because the head was missing. Back then you didn't have DNA. You had dental records and fingerprints, and I don't think they fingerprinted kids in the 1920s. So back to the trial. He was found guilty of first-degree murder. Judge George R. Freeman sentenced him to death by hanging. But the families, even though they got a guilty conviction, the families of the victims didn't really feel like they had any closure because they had no bodies to bury. Their children were missing, their children were murdered, but they had nothing to take home and to bury and to bring closure. So it really wasn't a complete satisfying outcome for the families of these kids. So Gordon was sentenced to death, and he went to jail to await his death sentence. While he was there, he used to repeatedly make lewd gestures at his jailers just to taunt them. He would taunt the victims' mothers, I guess by writing letters to them. I don't think he could call them. But supposedly he would taunt the victims' mothers while he was locked up. He was finally hung on October 12th of 1930. Right before he was hung, it said that he had a breakdown and confessed to everything. His last words were, quote, "Say a prayer for me," right before the trap door swung open. And it took 12 minutes of dangling before he died. It wasn't instant. Now, even though he was only convicted of those 3 murders, it's believed that he committed at least 20. When you look at the amount of bones that they found on the property and the stories that Sanford had told them, it's believed that the number is at least 20, possibly even more. Police never arrested or convicted Sanford. They considered him to be a victim, even though he helped in the crimes. Because he was abused and tortured and threatened, they considered him to be a victim. So they let Sanford go, and he wound up spending 2 years in a really, really good reform school. And then he moved back to Canada, and he wound up leading as normal of a life as you could expect. He kind of put everything behind him, and he led a really good normal life. He served in World War II, he got married, he adopted 2 sons, and he lived a full normal life. After he died, his son Jerry Clark approached Anthony Flacco, I hope I'm saying his name right, about writing a book about his dad and the true story. Anthony initially said no because the thought of getting into the details of the murders and sexual abuse of these little boys was just too disturbing for him. But the fact that Sanford had survived it and come out of it all to lead a normal, happy life captured his interest. So he went ahead and agreed to work with Jerry, and he wrote the book called The Road Out of Hell in 2009 about the whole true story of the case. Jerry, in an interview, had talked about how he found out about what his dad had gone through. He said that, when he was older, his dad kind of came up to him and said, "Hey, I need to tell you about something before anybody else comes and tells you." He was afraid he would hear the story from somebody else. So he just kind of sat him down and he told him, "Hey, look, my uncle kidnapped me when I was a little kid, And he did these murders, and he did all this sexual abuse. He did this stuff to me, and he forced me to do it. He told Jerry, I'm going to tell you this story one time, and then I'm never going to talk about it again. Because he had come out of it so not damaged, like you would expect, that Jerry just wanted his story to be told. So Anthony went ahead and told it. But it took a couple tries for Jerry asking him before he finally agreed to do it. And after he agreed to do it, he was glad that he did it. At the end of all this, when the trial was over and the execution was done, the town changed its name from Wineville to Mira Loma, which is Spanish for View of the Hills. And they changed the name in order to dissociate itself from the murders. They wanted to get away from that. You know, the name of the town was like nationally known. So they were hoping it would make them kind of disappear off the map. And now here's this new little town called Mira Loma. The original house on the farm still stands today, and it has residents. And it still looks the same as far as the shape. Now, granted, it's been updated and painted and everything else. But there's no additions built onto it or anything like that. It's still the original house. And it has people who live there. The residents hate the publicity that it brings, which kind of makes you wonder, like, you know, they had to have known the notoriety behind this house before they bought it. If they didn't want the publicity, I mean, you know, people are going to be constantly driving by, slowing down, coming up to it, taking pictures and whatnot. Why buy it if you weren't prepared for that? There, if you look at videos and pictures, they have an electrified gate and fence around the house to try and prevent people from going in and messing with it. And again, this was the Wineville chicken murders, or Wineville chicken coop murders. Gordon Stewart Northcott and his mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, 1926 to 1928. And then his nephew, Sanford Clark, who came out in the end to lead a great normal life. The town today, again, is called Mira Loma. If you're in California, you're in that area, you can ride by the house. I don't know the street that it's on, but you can find the house. I'm sure if you ask some locals, they all probably know where it's at. But ride by the house, check it out. Well, that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget again to go to our website, peculiartalk.com. Don't forget to check out my social media on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. You can find those links on the website. And definitely don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of these episodes. I release a new episode every week. Don't forget, you can subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube, and also Podomatic. Podomatic is the home of my podcast. Make sure you don't miss any new episodes. Next week, since I didn't do a UFO story this week, I was debating between a UFO story or a true crime story. And since I picked true crime this week, I'm going to do a UFO story next week. So be sure to come back and check for that episode. Until then, thanks for listening.